Hello, for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, I am excited once again to join you in this time of what we would call holy convocation, or what we call a mikra kodesh in the Hebrew, the coming together, the corporate collective consciousness, basically a joining together in a unified desire to learn more, understand more about Torah. We all have it. I have it. The people out in my internet audience have it. And so we are seeking the mystical or the soul side of Torah. And one of the things that we have been exploring is cycles. So I want to talk a minute about a cycle in terms of a biblical Hebrew perspective, okay? And that would be that cycles are not two-dimensional. What do I mean by that? I mean that the repeating of something does not result in a return to the place where you were, okay? I've oftentimes in the past said you can't stay where you are and go with God, right? Well, let's look at that more from this mystical soul of Torah side and say, okay, if that's true, then I can't stay where I am. Flux or movement, right? There's a proceeding forward, but really it's not a proceeding forward. Why? Because it's cyclical. We have to accept that it is round, right? That it is curved, that it is a circle, right? It is a geometric circle. However, that's not actually accurate either, because you don't return to the same point you began with. You return to a point just a little bit more elevated, don't we? When we come around to the cycle, say, for example, the cycle of Yom Kippur. What is the cycle of Yom Kippur? Well, there's two things that we need to take into consideration when we're dealing with the cycle of Yom Kippur. First, it is very important to understand that the cycle of Yom Kippur is actually a year-long, or 365 day, right? Yom, 365 days movement. It's very important, because one of the things that when you think about is that you get once, or one time during the year, there's a moment in which there is a maintenance on your soul, okay? So, for example, let's say that we just use a very simple thing like a person, a friend of mine getting a new car, okay? Now, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And so the first most important commandment in the 10 commandments is actually the last commandment. However, in the list, it's the first actual commandment. So what do I mean by that? I mean that there's kind of a trick to this, that what will happen is that when Torah gives a list, the first thing mentioned in the list is the thing that should receive the most respect or priority. But that is not the thing that's going to have the highest purpose. So in terms of that, we have covetousness, right? So let's talk a minute about covetousness. We have this principle that covetousness is desiring or wanting. Now, we could get into the attraction behind that. We could get into the energy behind that. But in its simplicity, it's a wanting something that is not actually available to you and should not be available to you. And so thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, thy neighbor's ox, thy neighbor's cart, etc., etc. Well, we're not gonna get into this too much, but the idea is my friend gets a new car. Now, a new car is nice. It's something that I like, right? Maybe the horsepower, maybe the engine, maybe the cargo space, who knows? And so I react with jealousy. Now, what is jealousy? Jealousy is actually proof that you're not walking in your purpose, that you are not walking in your fullest potential. And so it's a little mechanism that activates and says you could have better. Unfortunately, our emotional or distrustful heart reaction to that will be one of passion. I want it, and I want it with passion, right? And so as a result of that, now I conclude that I want that car. Now I start coming up with all kinds of different ideas or things that says, oh, well, maybe he'll give it to me. Maybe it'll break down and I'll be able to fix it and he won't want it anymore. Whatever the things that I'm trying to start to draw it into my life. That's covetousness. So now we come around to Yom Kippur. Now all that's happened is I desired the car. I did not actually get the car, okay? All I did is desire it. I wanted what he had, and therefore I began to technically with the energies and the attractions and all that, I began to draw that away from him towards me. And you can see where this gets into danger. We start getting to thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's maidservant, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so in principle, then we come around to Yom Kippur, right? Yom Kippur says, okay, he coveted, therefore something of his has to be coveted. That's the balance. There has to be balance. Always with the balance when it comes to Yahweh, okay? And so what we need to do then is we say, well, okay, I get to Yom Kippur and I'm like, I coveted the car. I'm sorry, right? And so then what happens? Now I'm beating my breast, right? But the principle is since I repented, since I came into Yom Kippur with a teshuvah, which is an intention to turn the other way, right? And an intention to return to the tent at the time of temptation next time. That's all it is. That's all teshuvah is. Teshuvah says next time it comes around, I'm going to do it right this time, right? Okay. So now what happens is another year goes by. And we come back to that moment with the new car. And yet again, another friend gets another new car. And I have the power now and the wisdom, because I know the anguish of coveting, to overcome coveting. And so I say, okay, I'm glad you got the new car. I'm excited for you. You know, I rejoice with my friend. Well, then we come to around to Yom Kippur again, and now the scales are balanced the other way, right? Like, wait a minute, he did the right thing. Now we got to fix that too. All right, so now the balance comes and says, all right, we're going to reward, right, all the blessings from Deuteronomy 28 upon this man who has chosen not to covet. He teshuvah and he chose not to covet. So you can see how this can last 3, 4, or 5 years, depending on how well you overcome a temptation or whatever. Because if you don't overcome the temptation, step into the sin, and then come around to Yom Kippur and you do not repent, it will be another year before that comes back around to you again. And when it does, the remedy will be the reciprocation. Always with the balance, right? Okay. The reason this is so important is because when we get into the idea of cycles, you can see that there's an elevation here. You can see that as I go into my teshuvah, and then I come back around to that season of the car, and I overcome it, and then I come back around to Yom Kippur, and they balance it, and then I come back around to that season again. Guess who gets a car? That's the principle here, right? You get rewarded with the thing that you chose not to try to take from your neighbor. That's the premise. Now, is it guaranteed I'm going to get that car? Am I going to get a car? That's a little bit dynamic, and I'm not going to mess with that. But the premise is that's what it says in Deuteronomy 28, that there would be an elite reward for obedience to Torah. But you could see that although we were going around in a circle, okay, so let's start at the beginning here. In fact, you know what? Let's get on the board with it. That sounds like an actual good plan, because then I can actually illustrate this a little bit better. So jumping over to the board, let's just draw us a circle. Blah, 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 blah. All right, right? So this is a two-dimensional circle, which means what? If I start here, okay, of course it would be blue. If I start here, and I come back around to here, then that's two-dimensional, right? There's nothing else going on there. But the truth is that's what's actually happening. Let's do this one, this medium pen. What's actually happening is there is this going on, right? There's an elevation. So we're starting at point number one. And so let's talk about this a minute. If we illustrate it from a two-dimensional perspective, then we have what? We have that first initial, we'll just call it sin, right? And then we're going to come around and we're going to come around, say maybe Yom Kippur is here. Right? And then we're going to come around to the sin again. And if it was teshuvah, then it becomes temptation. And if it wasn't teshuvah, then it becomes judgment. But either way, we'll call this reciprocation. Wonderful spelling. Okay, so temptation and or judgment. So then if we overcome the temptation, then that automatically equates to what? A reward, which is definitely a come up, right? It's definitely an upgrade. It's definitely an elevation, which means what? We start with the sin here. We come around to Yom Kippur, say about here. And as we're working our way up the line, we come back to the sin here. No matter what, there's progression. Okay. And let's talk about that for a minute. Let's explain what I mean as to why there is progression. You say, well, how could there be progression if you don't repent from the sin? I will tell you. Remember the concept of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is a mercy, an act of mercy. Why? Because what people want to do if you pluck somebody's eye out is beat the brakes off of you, right? No, you just get the eye plucked out. What's that premise? That premise is, let's say we take a peach pit, right? Drop it in the ground, right? A tree comes up. Does it produce one peach? No, it produces a bunch of peaches. You plant something, you sow something to what? The flesh, then you reap corruption, which means you've got a whole tree of peaches of corruption now you have to eat. Well, what's Torah say? He only has to eat one. I'll eat the rest, right? Because who is Torah? Torah became flesh and dwelt among us, John chapter 1, verse 20, or verse 14, right? Yeshua, the principle of salvation based upon the concept of crying out. Crying out, the Yeshua principle, which is what? Destroyer watches. Destroyer watches what? For the wolf who's going to eat the sheep. What does Yeshua mean? To violently snatch out of the mouth of the wolf, right? And so the premise is now this judgment comes, the wolf gets the sheep, but he pulls them out of the sheep, and that's that. That's done. So why is judgment a force of benefit? Because it completes the debt. And he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. He took that concept and applied it as a thing to pay the debt, so to speak, okay? Which gives us that concept of the kinsman and redeemer, which means that we are what? We are slaves now to righteousness and not to sin. This is Paul's concept in Romans chapter 6. However, that is still a come up, because when you come back to, so you sinned here, Yom Kippur said that you had to have some sort of judgment because you didn't repent, and boom, it's done there, done. What, even though that is a dropout, even though that's a pour out, even though that's lack and decrease, it's done, which is a benefit to you because it could invariably not be done, right? It could be something that goes on and on and on and on and on. You could be eating that tree for the rest of your life off of that one sin if it wasn't for the Yeshua principle, if it wasn't for the Torah that gives you the mercy of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, where people are like, oh, the law is a burden. You have to have an eye for an eye. Well, what would you propose we do in the judicial system when somebody does something wrong? Because I can tell you right now, the American judicial system is not following eye for an eye, are they? No, they are not. They are doing a very, very dark thing in that we are the leading prison industrial complex in the world. So what's my point? My point is that Torah is a mercy compared to what's going on. But there's your benefit, right? There's your force of benefit. It's done, right? Done. In fact, let me go ahead and write that on the board just to go ahead and put some emphasis on the compare contrast on American justice versus Yahweh's justice. Done. Move on. Keep going with your life. Get it over with, right? Get it over with. Get the spanking over with. All right. So why is that so important? Because now what we got going on is an idea that whether it be a temptation or a judgment, there is a elevation. There's a movement upwards. Now, here's the part that's important. In the same way, and I'm going to go ahead and illustrate this with a different color. In the same way, and let's go ahead and go to the board so you don't have to look at my head. In the same way, let's go ahead and use, let's see, I was using blue. Let's use that color right there. All right. In the same way, even though that this is a two-dimensional map of what is going on, sin, Yom Kippur, sin turns into temptation or judgment, and temptation can turn into reward, right, in that season. But remember, this all has to be done during the feast day season. We'll get into that. But here, we're now watch this. What's actually happening is there is also an expansion. Why is there an expansion? Because, make it a big expansion so you get the point. The reason why there's an expansion like that, an outward expansion, a spiral, the golden mean, the sacred geometry of that outward movement of the Fibonacci sequences, etc., all of that is based upon the idea of that original inception, the seed going into the egg, the development of the zygote, etc. When something is born, it grows. When something has an inception, it grows. When something has an ideal beginning, it grows. Which means what? Your sin, so that first time of coveting, you get the experience of the guilt of the sin, right? Your conscience accuses or defends you, and whether you have broken Torah or not on the day of judgment, which is what? Yom Kippur, once a year. Not some eternal judgment seat at the end of time. Let that go, because you are in the here and now, not the end of time, okay? So you need to understand that there's an action occurring upon your life, a mechanism, a karmic mechanism occurring on your life that has a 1 year or 365-day cyclical process. Now, there happens to be miniature Yom Kippurs. There's a 28-day Yom Kippur. There's a 28-day judgment, right? There's a weekly judgment. Because every time you cross Shabbat and you dishonor it, your next week is probably going to have some problems. Now, there's some exceptions to that because we know sometimes the angels schedule a bad Shabbat, right? They schedule a bad Shabbat. We learned that from Baal Shem Tov. All right, so now here is the premise. The premise is that now what we have to do is accept that there is an upward outward. So what is this outward? Well, we can agree on one thing. The more outward it is, the less inward it is, which means what? It has something to do with influencing the environment around you, which means this cycle here, this spiral, this outward movement is influence. Influence of what? Well, obviously, when we start coveting, we're drawing that car away from our friend. All of a sudden, he starts having mechanical problems or whatever. Or we get the kid who's rebellious and says to his mom, I wish I never knew you. And next thing you know, poof, he comes up missing, right? Etc. There's an outward influence upon the environment. Well, that outward influence upon the environment is also upward. Which means what? We actually don't have the springy thing. We have something else. So let's go draw that. Okay, and the way that I'm going to do this, I'm just going to go ahead and, okay, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and shrink this down And we'll move it over here because why? We need this true spiral. We need the actual spiral that's occurring. So the true spiral, which we're going to draw with a fine pen here, is going to go like this. Okay? And so the premise is we have that initial moment right here at this point, right? Then we have Yom Kippur somewhere around here, and then we have this return to that initial moment for temptation or judgment, and then we have some sort of either reward or cancellation, right, at this point. So the concept is that it's going upward and outward. Well, in terms of that, what we need to think about is something that has to do with memory, okay? Now, there's two ways we could go about this. We could go straight up into the neurolinguistic programming, right? We could go into the vaults of the mind and into the neuropeptides, that cause memory to occur, and neuroplasticity and all those things. But then we also need to look in the realm of the spiritual influence, right, in terms of the actual information being communicated. What do I mean by this? That there's actually a storage of information that appears to at all times be three-dimensional or holographic in nature, and has a tendency to be resonant no matter whether or not the person realizes it. That information then is communicated to every single other human being that encounters that information. They may read it in terms of body language. They may read it in an action that causes a trauma response to a wound. They may read it in terms of a entitlement reaction, et cetera, et cetera. Regardless, the point being is that it's an upward-outward expansion, right? It's an upward-outward expansion, which means what? It has influence, and that influence seems to reach through time. What I mean by that, as it's moving up the spiral here, right? It is reaching out and influencing everything around it. Why? Because your adversity becomes your strength, and your strength becomes your expertise, and your expertise becomes your purpose. Your expertise becomes your ministry. It becomes your responsibility to bring new information to the ignorant who are experiencing the same things, right? To warn, to be able to teach and give wisdom. The first man who learned how to chop down a tree, right, figures out how to make an axe and chop down a tree. We could get into all kinds of stuff about that, but the premise is that basically he now has that knowledge. What was his adversity? To get the tree chopped down. What was his strength? To build the axe and chop down the tree. What became his ability then? To cut trees. Now other people need trees. Now he's got a business. But here's the interesting thing. What's the business doing for him? Only thing it's doing is providing for his what? Family, or for himself, depending on whether or not he ever went that route. But the premise is that procreation is at the very core and instinct of a human being, and specifically a male, who's able to make more than one a night, right? In terms of that concept, then we know that most likely he would be providing for a family. So now he's got the family business. The family business is logging, and he's got the trucks and the insurance and all the other junk that goes into logging, and the guys with the chainsaws and the ropes and all that stuff. And now he's getting too old to chop down trees. Now, we know his experience and learnings have been doing this thing his whole life, right? He's learned how to chop down trees more efficiently. He's learned how to what? To actually deliver trees to the customer more efficiently. He's got employees. He's got lots of income coming in, and he's been taking care of his family. He's feeding them. He's built the log cabin because of the logs, right? He's got all the stuff that are involved with that original inception idea. I need this tree for a cabin concept. And now all of a sudden, here we are at the end of our days. And what happens? Well, according to Solomon, something really bad happens. All his work, his whole entire life has been absolutely meaningless because what? There's no U-Haul behind a hearse. He's going to die in his old age. He's no longer able to come in or go out of the tent, right? And now he has what? He has a legacy. He has a storage of information that if he dies with it, it ends with him. And so the legacy is that now he raises up his firstborn. He teaches his firstborn the family business, and he prepares the firstborn to be the clan leader, prepares him to chop down trees and run businesses and control employees and manage supply and demand and logistics, etc., etc. And for what? Just to die, right? So the legacy falls to the Yeled, falls to the child, falls to the conception. The legacy falls to the conception, and the conception, when it is fully, when it is come to its fullness, ends up becoming what? A child, and that child is raised up in the way he should go. And when he is an adult, he is granted agency. And now that agency gives him the power over the family business as the old man gets ready to pull his feet into his bed. One last time, he brings upon him a blessing. And after he pronounces that blessing, he breathes his last. And now it is the son's responsibility to repeat the same thing. Meaning what? There are three elements to legacy: the legacy maker, the legacy receiver, and the legacy keeper. Okay? And the way that I want you to think about this is in terms of the idea that this man builds for his next generation. As I train my replacements. Well, if I train my replacements, then I am the legacy maker. My replacements are the legacy receivers. However, if they continue the legacy of After His Heart Ministries, after I am long gone, then they become what? They become legacy keepers. And so on the inception of a legacy, we have the initial sin. And then on the inception of that initial sin, we have influence going on. For example, let's say that we have the sin of murder. Remember that anger and hate influence murder. And so the concept is that now we have an outburst of anger and hate, and that outburst of anger and hate creates an inception in the next human being, and that inception in the next human being now becomes what? An original thought, an original idea, and they begin to take upon themselves the burden and also the grief of that anger outburst, and they begin to respond with anger and outburst. And thus you have influenced or created a new environment of angry outburst. Now, that doesn't necessarily equate to an absolute response that results in, again, another cycle. But it does show the power of influence, doesn't it? A passionate reaction to a hateful thought. That's all it really is, a passionate reaction to a hateful thought, resulting in an eventual attempt to cause an expiration of the body. Okay, so I want you to understand that if we have a legacy maker, we have a legacy receiver, and we have a legacy keeper, then we need to understand that there's three purposes in legacy. Why is this so important? Because there is an instruction to do something that pertains to legacy. Let's take a look at that. We've been talking about cycles, and we've been working through information as we go. But I think it's important when we're working through all this information, because you would agree with me, we have not necessarily touched on the same subject every time, but cycles has been a theme throughout, right? Cycles has been a theme throughout. There is a cyclical nature to the natural order processes of reality. Nothing is stagnant and nothing stays the same as it was. Everything is in a constant state of flux. Okay, and so, and here's the interesting thing about this. Let's say that as a result of wounds and as a result of limiting beliefs and a result of entitlements, a person develops a malevolent soul, okay? And as they operate in that malevolence, that means that humans become what? Resources and enemies, and that's it. Something to be defended against and something to be exploited, which means that malevolence will always result in exploitation through coercion, force, or manipulation. And that exploitation will always result in some sort of inception of a new death, a new cycle of temptations and darkness that has nothing to do with the initial influencer. So the reason why this is so important is because when we're getting into this, what you need to realize is that these cycles have memory. These cycles actually have memory. At the moment of this inception, it is recalled here at Yom Kippur. And then it is returned upon here at that initial inception again. And then it is again recalled here, right? And then again rewarded or judgment, etc. Okay, you can see how this continues to go up, 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 up. So why is that so important? Well, okay, so if it's recalled here, then there's memory in the cycle itself. Okay, let's see if we have anything that would indicate to us that we are to somehow bring into fruition memory in terms of cycles. Okay, so then the way that we need to do this is obviously we need to we need to find a cycle in Scripture and see if there's a commandment about memory. Now remember, all memory is information contained about the inception, conception, birth, and growth of that original moment, right? Whether it be a child, so on the physical level, whether it be a reciprocation, which would be more on the spiritual level, at least on the mechanism level or the world of forces, right? We are working with a cycle. So we've got information, right? So if we go to Genesis, chapter 1, and we go into the information about cycles, right? Remember that we have this idea of let's go back. This one. There we go. Remember, we have this idea of the signs, right? Leotiot, right? The otiot. And then we have the moedim, right? We have the leomim, and then of course we have the shanim. And what are those? Those are signs, which we've already discussed, would be signs in the heavens specifically, because it says, let them what? The travelers on the elliptical, right? The sun, the moon, and the constellations that are on the elliptical, or the zodiac, or what we call in Hebrew the mazal, which Job mentions when Yahweh's chatting with Job and's like, hey, dude, there's some things you don't know. Can you do this? Can you control this little clock that I built? Because if you can, I need some advice. I don't know, maybe it's broken or something, and he wanted Job to give him some advice. Who knows? But the point being is that there is what? There's OTOT, there's signs. And then there's what? Seasons? No, that's not the word. We're not talking about summer, winter, fall, spring. We're not talking about that stuff, right? I'm sorry, summer, winter, spring, and fall. Okay, I can't get them in good sequence today. Anyways, the point being is we're talking about Moedim, appointed times. And those Moedim are what? The feast days, which is what? The reaping season, right? The harvest, the grape harvest, the wheat harvest, the barley harvest, the fruit harvest. The other harvest I can't think of right now, but it's important. Oh yeah, the olive harvest. All right. And so what's my point? My point is that the reaping season, remember, you will reap what you sow. If you sow to the flesh, you will reap corruption. If you sow to the spirit, you'll reap everlasting life. And according to John chapter 17, verse 3, everlasting life is knowing God. And remember that Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore a son. So is it with the intercourse between the intensification of all power in the universe and his creation when they worship him, which is what? To bow the knee or to submit. Not raise your hands and sing songs. That's hallel. That's praise. And that's a very different mechanism. And we don't need to worry about that mechanism today. But when we worship, when we bow down, when we accept the authority of the greater and acknowledge our receiving as the lesser, and we understand that there's a dynamic of male and female, masculine and feminine there, then we all of a sudden arrive at something important, and that is the idea that the Moedim are tied into your reaping and sowing. The feast days are tied into your reaping and sowing, but that's just one set of cycles. Then we get into the Yomim, right? We get into days, which what? 365 days in a year. That's a solar measurement, right? Or what? 1 week, which is what? A circa septane, or a 7-day cycle, right? And there's all kinds of biorhythms and health elements and all kinds of things where we can prove that a circa septane is present within nature and within humans, a desire to rest on the seventh day. So then we've got a cyclical process of days, right? So we have days for the 365-day year, which is our Yom Kippur, right? And then we have our reciprocation, which is going to come at that time. That's reciprocation is going to come in the season in which we committed the sin to begin with, right? There's going to be a return to the season again at that time next year. Right? Because the angels are only opening the books once a year, checking the works, making the balances, and they're sealed, and that's that, and it's done, right? And then we get into the concept of years, and that comes into where we have what? The 7-year cycle. There's our number 7 again, a 7-year cycle, or what we call a Shemitah, in which the 7th year you let the ground go fallow and you release slaves and all kinds of other things. Shouldn't use that word slave because that's actually not what they are. You release indentured servants. Okay, now moving on to the concept of years, or moving upward in the concept of years, we count 7 Shemitahs, and then in that last year, because 7 times 7 is 49, in that 50th year we have a jubilee, which is a release of contractual responsibility for loans, in which now all of a sudden the property or the consideration for contracts is canceled, and property and land is returned to its original owner. Point being is that we have all these cycles. However, we're going to concentrate specifically on Yomim today, which we have Yomim, or the days, actually activating our Yom Kippur cycle, which is what we have on the board here. Or we have another cyclical process, which is what? That's that circa septane, or that 7-day cycle that's present in nature. A 7-day cycle then becomes what? The Sabbath, the Shabbat, the great rest, right? It says God rested on that day and that he blessed it and sanctified it. And we proved a plausibility in one of our teachings in this set of cycles teachings, part 3, I think it was, or maybe it was part 2. We proved that if we can establish that creation is still continuing, then the intensification of all power in the universe, or the creator God Yahweh, has what? He has continued to rest on the Shabbat. Why? Well, we don't need to get into that part per se, but then we also have learned that the Sabbath, or the Shabbat, was made for man, right? It was made for man. So if we could find a verse that says, look to the memories, right? Consider the memories, then in a strange sort of way, it's to consider the legacy. And if we consider the legacy, then we need to find out who the legacy maker is. We need to find out who the legacy receiver is. And we need to learn who the legacy keeper is, right? Okay, and so what we need to do is we need to find a verse that gives us that. Well, let's take a look at Exodus chapter 20, and let's look at verse 8. Remember. Okay, let's talk a minute about mnemonics. Mnemonics is the study of memory, and mnemonics is generally termed for when you create some sort of intentional anchor for your memory. In fact, there are a lot of motivational speakers and wealthy people who have written books to give you a better understanding of how to use your memory. But in general, one of the things that we have to accept about context sensitivity is that there has to be a reproduction. There has to be a reproduction and a continuance of a context. Well, let's talk about context for a minute. So we have something that we call meta. Basically, the whole idea behind meta. How can I explain that in the best way? So it's what you smell, it's what you see, it's what you hear, and it's what you taste and what you feel, but it's the intensity of those, the vividness of those, the moving picture recording of those, and the colorization of those that actually activates a powerful memory. And in general, what we encounter is that memories that have stayed the test of time have received a very, very vivid, moving connectedness to the context. So I can give you a few examples in my own life of this idea of context memory. When I was a child, there was a community center in Aspen. And this community center in Aspen is where all of the music students from the music school would go and eat. So they would go from the music school to the community center. Community center would give them, provide them with food. I think it was part of their stay at the music school. And of course, for those of you who don't know what the music school was, there is an international music school in Aspen at that time that basically is bringing in the greatest conductors, the greatest composers, and the greatest musicians, and they all study under each other to learn a more effective, more powerful version of music, of their instrument, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the most experienced violin players go, and some of the greatest violin players get together, and they all figure out what is the best way to play the violin, right? That's the Aspen Music School. Anyways, the music students, they come and they eat at this community center. Well, my father was the maintenance supervisor for this community center, and so I was often in this building, and I would encounter these music students. And so it's interesting. They had a fountain drink dispenser there for you to get your beverages. And I, for the first time in my life, went and got a glass of cherry Coke, okay? And I took that cherry Coke and I sat down and I met this lady from Japan. She was probably 17, 18 years old, and she played the bassoon, I believe it was. So at any rate, she and I are sitting talking together. She barely speaks any English, and she just loved me. I'm this little kid, and I got this cherry Coke, and everything's great. Well, she invited me to the music school to come and sit next to her while she studied in the orchestra. So then I can go and sit in the orchestra, listen to the orchestra, listen to these amazing composers and conductors and teachers teach the greats. And so cherry Coke is attached to Asusa, who was my friend, and attached to sitting in the Aspen Music School as a guest in front of the greats. And so every time I have cherry Coke, I remember that memory. That's context-sensitive taste, right? The context retrieves the memory from the vault. Okay, so now we have this concept or this idea that mnemonics has something to do with the emotional attachment to the cognition at the moment that then is recorded as some sort of storage, and in that recording is the highlights, obviously, but also the intensity, right? And so the more intense memories get the context sensitivity, and the less intense memories, it's harder to pull up. That's all kind of this modality. They're meta modalities, so to speak. Okay, so now what is so important here is that it says remember. Now, that's in the English, right? That's in the English. Remember the Sabbath day. Remember the circumseptadian what? Cycle. Remember the circumseptadian cycle. Remember the seventh day. Yes. So let's take a look at this. Remember the seventh day. Let's look in the Hebrew. Zachar et yom. There's our word yom. Remember, let them be for what? Signs, seasons, days, and years. There's our yom. Remember our yom, right? What's yom? The yom of Hashavat. The yom of Hashavat, right? Hashavat, when we jump into that, is what? Sabbath. From Shabbat to cease or desist. Okay? So remember this day of ceasing. Remember the day of ceasing or rest. And then we have this idea that what? It's for the sake of his, see that one right there? That is third person masculine singular possessive pronoun. Okay, his. Remember his what? For the sake of his holiness. Okay, so because that's lekadosh. Let's go into that one real quick. Holiness, right? To consecrate, sanctify, prepare, dedicate, to be hallowed, to be holy, to be sanctified, to be separate. But in context of everything, generally speaking, holiness. Kadash or kodesh, which is the act of holiness, is the whole idea. Look at how simple, how small and short this sentence is. Zakor. Zakor. And of course, Zakor is actually in the infinitive absolute. What does that mean? That means it is an ongoing action without beginning or end that is not assigned to any specific object or subject. Okay? Which means everything remembers. Specifically, it is in the infinite absolute, which means what? It is a noun. So it is the memory, right? Well, when we get into memory, it needs to be context sensitive, which means something needs to what? Awaken within us. Let's talk about that for a minute. So it's telling us to remember the Sabbath, but we don't know the Sabbath, do we? We don't. Unless you were born Jewish, raised in an Orthodox environment, and generally speaking, had all of the Shomer Shabbat rules applied to you, turn off your phone, don't turn on the light switch, etc., you are pretty oblivious to the Sabbath. And I'm going to propose to you that you're oblivious enough that you don't even understand what Yeshua said when he said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Because what do we want to do? We want to instantaneously assign a burden of responsibility to ourselves to make the Sabbath special, right? And the truth is the Sabbath is given to us as a gift, a legacy that will have a receiver, a maker, and a keeper. Okay, so let's talk about this. The concept here then becomes an idea that there needs to be memory context activation of the Sabbath. So let's say that we have some person who does not believe in God, does not believe in the supernatural, does not believe in magic, does not believe in any of the things that would be considered the mythos of existence, as opposed to the logos or the logical conclusions. Obviously, we could get into all kinds of things like evolution. We could get into all kinds of things about bunk science and pseudosciences and all that kind of stuff. But in the end, you could say that that person is just generally not a believer. Now, all of a sudden, out in the middle of nowhere, for whatever reason, they bought into intelligent design, and all of a sudden, boom, they got a Bible in front of them. And unlike the guy that was raised a Christian and is supposed to believe a certain way and is never supposed to deviate from that, he's like, oh, let me open my mind. And all of a sudden, he discovers that he's supposed to keep Torah. And next thing you know, it says, what? Remember the Sabbath day. Whoa, there, I'm done. I don't have any Sabbath days to remember. Right? The poor guy. He has no memory of a Sabbath. So how does he remember it? Well, this starts to get into something a little bit more powerful. And so the premise is that basically what we have going on is that there must be a context sensitivity to this cycle that has nothing to do with your current lifetime cognition. Because this poor man is coming along, right? This ideal non-believer is coming along, finding Torah, being liberated, right? And coming into the liberation of that existence, the blessings of Deuteronomy 28 instead of the curses, right? If a Gentile, though not having the law, does the things of the law, he what? He shows himself to be a law unto himself, right? He's going to do it. He's going to do it his way, but he's going to be obedient to it. And then in addition to that, he is what? Shows the law to be written on his heart. Where does that come in? The conscience that accuses him or defends him on Yom Kippur, right? Okay, so now that being the case, then we have this guy coming in. Oh, and that's the other thing. If a Gentile, though not having the law, does the things of the law, shows himself to be circumcised, which means what? He gets the promise of Abraham. He gets the land, right? Okay, and so he becomes what? Israel. Okay, we won't go into that, but the simple fact is that Abraham gave the land to Isaac. Isaac gave the land to Jacob. Jacob gave the land to his 12 sons, the sons of Israel. Yeshua comes along, creates an adoption that makes it optional for a Gentile to come into the fold of Israel, be grafted in, and therefore experience the blessings and therefore be an heir to the land because it was promised to the descendants of Abraham. That was a mouthful. So what's my point? My point is that he comes along, he becomes grafted in, he's keeping Torah, but he has no memory of Shabbat. So what is this memory of Shabbat? What is Zakar? Well, we could look at it from the point of view of influence. So we could go to the Jews and say, hey, how do I keep Shabbat? I went into Torah, and now I want to keep Shabbat. They're going to give you a kippah, tell you to renounce whatever else you got going on, and next thing you know, you're sitting in the pew making prayers on Shabbat. You don't even know what you're saying. You don't even know what you're praying. And hey, but you're a good Jew, right? Or worse yet, you could go to a pastor and ask him how to keep the Sabbath, and he's going to instruct you to go sit down on Sunday and listen to his rhetoric that has all kinds of pagan infiltrations and God knows what else that totally ruined our religion. Well, it doesn't matter what direction you go. There's no guidance there. So the influence isn't all that great of an information, is it? The influence is not that great of a way to go about this. What he really needs to do is he needs to tap into the idea that if memory is context sensitive, he has a memory of Shabbat that transcends his lifetime. And that memory of Shabbat actually is a memory of a cyclical process that transcends his lifetime. We could accept that it's epigenetics. We could accept that it was a past life experience. We could accept all those things, but we need to remember that at the inception of everything, at the intensification of all power in the universe, and when we stuff all that into a definable, limited God, what do I mean by that? Because the intensification of all power in the universe is limitless. The intensification of all power in the universe is not defined, but then after we accept that we needed a perceivable God, we have a father, we have a husband, and so Yahweh becomes the father and husband, and so then now we have what? We have authority. We have the greater, we have the lesser. But the premise is that this perceivable God then what? Rests on the seventh day. Now, if everything proceeded out of him and is made by him, for him, through him, and all things exist as a result of him, then we have some sort of cosmic information present within our soul that has a memory of the first Sabbath. And that context needs to be activated. Well, then we need to start to get into the commandment of the Sabbath and why the commandment of the Sabbath occurs the way it does. Because as we get into that cyclical existence, we start to get into legacy. Why? Because the maker of the Sabbath happens to also be an emanation of you. You are an emanation of that maker. That's the only way you exist. In him we live and move and have our being. That's what Paul said. And so in that context, then, that means that you have a memory of the Sabbath. It's just you got to tap into something that you probably aren't ready to accept, and that is that the kingdom of heaven is within you and that you are an emanation of Yahweh, which means you're an Elohim. Which means that technically, if we wanted to put the word that is translated from Elohim into English, you are a God. And we can see that in what? In Psalm chapter 82. And we can see it in John chapter 10, where Yeshua says, you're all gods. Just accept it. Get over it. Why are you going to stone me? You're the same thing. Right? Now, why is that so important? Because one of the things that I really need you to get your mind wrapped around is if memory is context sensitive and there is an activation of that memory context, then you would agree with me then that if some sort of action was established, because remember when we talked about cycles and we talked about the feast days and we talked about activating the feast days, we talked about the idea that you doing the feast day actually activates it. Then you realize that there is a premise that when you keep that first feast day, you create a memory. And now you can reference that memory as to whether this feast day was pleasant or unpleasant, acceptable to your psyche. You have a bar that sets the standard. And as that improves, you're moving upward. And as that improves, you're moving outward. And as that improves, you're moving around to the point again. Why is that so important? Well, there's a number of reasons. The first one is, and it appears as though Yahweh created a commandment in order to create a context-sensitive activation. He says, no malakah, right? He says, no avodini or avodeh, right? He says, no work, no servile work. Then he has what? A mikra, right? A holy convocation. And that's the information that we have for the Shabbat. We know that it came first in the list in Leviticus and therefore is the firstborn. But we know that Sukkot, or the 8th day specifically, comes as the last day of all the feasts and therefore is the most important, because the first shall be last and the last shall be first. But we also know that the firstborn does get his status, right? But the spiritual intensity comes in the secondborn, or in that last commandment, or in that last thing on the list, which is why covetousness is so dangerous. Okay, and so now what we need to kind of get our minds wrapped around is this idea that actions that create context sensitivity promote the continuation. So what does that mean? We have a maker, he rests. Okay, fine, we do the blessed and sanctified, but that seems to have stopped at that. It seems to have stopped at that information in Torah. We don't have a continuation of that Torah, that commandment in Torah of blessing and sanctifying. And I do think that there is a place that says to call the Sabbath blessed, but I'm not going to get into that today. But the premise is that then there is instruction to cease, just as he ceased. In fact, that word in the Hebrew in that first Sabbath is ceasing, right? On the 7th day, he ceased, Shabbat. So why is this important? Well, because we're going to get into something that I like to call situational curse. Okay, situational curse. So there's a few things that are important here. The first one is that you need to identify that if memory is context sensitive, you have to activate the memory through an activation of those modalities or submodalities to identify the memory. Okay? And so what that generally means is that something causes you to have the memory again. And so all the emotion, all of the cognition, all of the experience of that memory repeats itself. And if it's a good memory, you're like, oh man, I remember that, right? If it's a bad memory, you're like, oh, well, speak of that again, right? Okay. And so the idea here then is we have this function of a repeat of actions activating the mnemonic process of remember, okay? But before we get too far deep into that, because obviously our next step is then to say, well, then tradition has a context-sensitive activation. Okay. We're going to get into the word zakar, So zakar is, as you can see, an adopted root. Remember, a child root contains a yod, a hey, a vav, or an aleph, or a doubled last letter. So we are going to have to do our diligence with this word zakar. As such, we should probably go ahead and document it on the board. And so here we go. We're going to go Zayin, and then we're going to go Kaf, and we're going to go Chesh, and we're going to say that we have what? We have the colors. We'll go yellow, which would be that line. We have green. Let's go green, and that will be that line, and then let's go pink, and that will be that line, okay? And so in principle then, with the yellow, we have Zayin Kaf, right? As a possible parent root. If we go with the we go with the green, then we have Zayin Fresh. Okay, and then if we go with the pink, then we have Kaf Fresh. So those are our possible parent roots. Now, having said that, let's hope that maybe it's still a traceable parent root and we won't have to go through all that. Because I think you guys would agree with me, it definitely takes some time to study it out. It definitely takes some time. And so I just copied the Strong's Concordance number and get this thing out of here. And I'm going to remove the H because the Strong's is concorded. The newer Strongs, the older Strongs are not, but the newer Strongs are concorded by H and then a number and G and then a number. And the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible doesn't deal in Greek. And so therefore we got to get rid of the H. I usually say, oh, I'm removing the H, and I realize it's possible that people didn't even know that that's what was going on. Okay, so let's see if we end up with an acceptable parent root. Oh, good, we get blessed. We got blessed with a parent root. That parent root is Kaf Resh. Okay, Kaf Resh. It says the pictograph Kaf is a picture of the palm of the hand. The Resh is a picture of the head. Combined, these mean palm of man. The palm as a hollowed out, as a digging, okay? And so our first is Kar, which is depression. What is of concave shape, such as the saddle or pasture in a valley, also may mean the sheep of a pasture, okay? So the word Kar. And then we have pasture, right? We have hollowed out, a hollowed out valley. And then we have it also as it can be a digger or somebody who digs out a hollowed out valley. And then of course we've got Farah, which is actually a how do I call this? Explain this. It's a cognate, but we're not going to get into the cognates today. All right, so we've got Kahri right here, Kahri, and it's a captain, right? And then we've got Mekera, which is what? A cave, a natural underground chamber or series of chambers that open to the surface, a hole in the rock. So whatever we got going on, there's a carving out occurring, right? We've got camel as in the hollow of the hump. And then we've got leaping or dancing around in a circle, which kind of gives you the idea of carving into the ground as you go around in the circle, or dance. And then we've got Akar is a farmer, one who digs the ground for growing crops, right? And then we've got Be'er, which is a well, which is basically another cognate, a dugout hole, usually a well or cistern. And then we're back to Ko'ar, a pit, right? A Ko'ar is a pit. A Ba'ar would be a pit. And we have Hakar. Hakar means to be wrong, right? Or to be digging out. I guess you could look at it from the point of view of digging in the wrong hole, so to speak. And then we've got Hakara, which is to look. And they really don't know why it's connected. And then we've got Kaka, which means what? To dig, to break, to loosen with an instrument or tool, to bargain in the sense of digging into a merchant. Okay. And then you've got core, which means to dig or examine or to look deeply. Oh, wow. Here we start to move into an area of what? Speculation, right? Okay. And then we've got core and bore as our two alternative spellings. And of course, one of those is a cognate and the other one is kind of an adaptation of that cognate. Okay. And then we've got what? Core, which is cistern. This is the place
that this is the place where Joseph was put when he was before he was sold, a hole or well that is dug out, a pit, right? Then we got a standard of measure is a core in the sense of depth. Okay, a standard of measure is a core in the sense of depth of a hollow cup going into a bag of flour and pulling out and creating an indentation. That's the concept there. And then we've got a fountain, right? A spring that comes out of a hole in the ground, the source of water necessary for life in the wilderness. And of course, we know that aquifers fill caverns or caves. All right, and then we've got kior, which is a cauldron or a large hollowed out metal pot, right? In the sense of a dug out container. We've got birth as in the digging out of the baby, right? The coming out of a hole, right? Coming out of a hollowed object. We've got kir as a hollowed object or a furnace, a hollow box formed out of brick or clay for cooking. And finally, we get to zakar, a recalling of events of the past or an act upon a past event as digging. Okay? So we've got an idea that remembering is to dig, right? To act or speak on behalf of another, to reenact a past event as a memorial. In the hifil or causative, it means to mention. Zakar is also a male, being the gender who begets offspring, one who acts and speaks for the family as a what? As a what? What is this concept? What is this idea of Zakar, meaning memory, and also male? The storyteller, right? So you have the legacy maker, you have the legacy receiver, so you have the story being told to the child, right? And then you have the child what? Keeping everything as it were through what? Through tradition, okay? Let's keep going on our words for a minute, but we're going to get back to tradition. All right, and then we have what? A remembering based on a past event, often through an annual festival. Oh, interesting. Look at that. A zeker is a memorial, a remembering based on a past event, often through an annual festival. Isn't it intriguing? That's going to come into our Yom Kippur concept here, right? Then we've got a zakor, right, which is male persons or men, right? And that's our word. Zakor is our word. Look at this. Let me show you. Right there. Zakor, right? All right, so zakor, memorial, right? Male persons. All right, so now moving on to azakar, a memorial, remembering based on past events, right? And then we've got zikron, which is a remembrance, a calling of past events, also an action based on a past event, right? And then we're going to get into digging again into haker. So let's talk a minute about this digging. It seems as though memory also has a concept of almost that a necessity or an instruction that you have to make an effort to bring it up. Now that's interesting because there's two forms of memory. You have memory that is absolutely invasive upon your environment as a result of an activation of context, and then an intention that you have to create that context in order to maintain connection to that memory. Oh boy, we're getting into some dangerous ground here. Okay, so now getting back to this, then we have the digging of the well, the examine, the intenting, search for details, examination. Interesting. That Hakar is the concept of examination, depth, a deep place as unexamined. Then we've got Kakar, something that is round, as in a round like a bowl, which would be a dug out container, right? Round as in the coin or round piece of gold or silver. And then we've got hikir in the sense of roundness. So now we're kind of building off the roundness of the bowl, which was a dug out object. And of course, you know that sometimes these parent roots build and build and build until you're way far away from the original. A dry measure, usually rendered as a talent. Oh, isn't that intriguing? In most translations, however, the word talent is a transliteration of the Greek word talanton, which was a Greek coin used in the Greek Septuagint for the Hebrew word kikar, right? And then we've got nakar, as in digging, or to recognize or to acknowledge or take notice in some definite way, right? And then we've got a nakar in the sense of a foreigner, a person who what? Is not recognizable, right? Belonging to or owning allegiance to a foreign country. And then we have a menakar, which is an acquaintance. This is somebody who is known, however, they are not kin, right? And then we have the concept of nikri, which is a foreigners or something that is foreign or situated outside its own country, alien in character, a strange person, place, or thing as being unrecognized. So here we have a building off of the idea of non-memory, right? There isn't a memory that exists and therefore it's unrecognizable. We've got nakar as in the digging, and then we've got nakar as in the pierce, and of course this is related to the female, the word for female, which is nekheva, but that's another story. And then we have a fissure, a division causing to become two pieces instead of one, a cleft or narrow chasm through the sense of being a piercing in a rock. And then we have a hollowed out container, which is kind of a continuation of that digging, or a platter or plate. And then we have the as in a serving dish. And that is it. So we did not have to do this, which is awesome. I'm glad that we didn't just make any assumption that we would have to, because it was an adopted root. However, here's the interesting thing about this. It has to do with reaching in and pulling out, right? And so there needs to be an intention to activate context memory. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Activate the context. Well, how can you activate the context if you've never had that memory, unless it transcends your lifetime? And so that's when we get into the idea that when we are told to cease and when we are told to have a mikra, that there is something that is memorable about that transcends our lifetime, because it's coming from the source who first rested. Well, what if we get into the non-Moedim? What if we get into cycles that are practiced, or cycles that are recognized or remembered, that do not represent the Torah of Yahweh, or the teaching and instruction of God? What if the action of a human being, they create a moment, they create a moment, and as they go into that moment, there is a concept of there being a memory being created, right? So there needs to be what? There needs to be a reactivation of that memory. So as the story is being told, or as the information is being communicated to the receiver. So the maker is creating a legacy. That legacy is now being given to the receiver. What is the receiver doing? The receiver is learning, right? Having an experience of learning. And then the keeper continues the legacy to the next generation. The maker creates the inception of the legacy to begin with. He starts it. The receiver learns about it and accepts it as part of its history and existence. But in order for the next generation to experience it, a keeper has to be present. So let's say that we take something like, let's do something benign that doesn't necessarily create an offense, because I would love to use Christmas right now, but I'm not going to. Let's say that there is a family tradition that on the 1st of June, everybody gets together and they take and slaughter a pig and put it in the ground, and they set the ground on fire and they have a pig roast, right? I'm sure some of you may be familiar with this concept. It's a very, very interesting way to barbecue food, and very tasty as well. And so they have this pig roast. And so what do we have? We have Torah saying, you shall not even touch the dead carcass of a pig, more or less eat it, right? And so we have Torah instructions saying, you shall not do this. And it says that if you do not honor the Torah, right? Deuteronomy 28, starting in verse 15, going to verse 68, all of these things will come upon you, right? If you do not honor the Torah. And we know that it's not a matter of judgment in the sense of God bringing down and cracking the whip or bringing the hammer down, but instead a removing of protections and an allowance for entities, malevolent entities, to enter in and an attack to the extent of a tapeworm ending up in your head, right? Or maybe not to the extent. Maybe that's the mercy. I don't know. Maybe that's the gentleness of this. I don't know. All I know is that he's coming back in Isaiah 66 with a strong rebuke for those who eat swine's flesh. And so as a result of that, we can identify that maybe it bothers Yahweh a little bit if you eat pig, right? But we have this family tradition that on June 1st, we have this big gathering and all of our friends come and all of our family comes and we eat this pig and we just enjoy the food and we have this exciting time, even though that it's a violation of the teaching instruction of the intensification of all power in the universe. God communicated to humanity he did not want you eating pork. And so as a result of that, then now we have this focus or this concept that there is a curse attached to that behavior. Now, why is that important? Because if you create a memory of it, so the first guy comes along, he says, we're going to roast a pig. All the family shows up, all the friends show up, pretty soon town's showing up, whatever. And I'm going to create a context. Now, every year after, now it's grandpa, and you tell the story. My grandpa used to make this amazing pulled pork sandwich from this pig that he'd bury in the ground and set on fire, right? And so now it's my grandpa. There is now legacy. The receiver was the children who were being taught to do it. And so what? The curse continues. Now, please understand, there is a sin unto death and a sin not unto death. John chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. 1 John chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. Which means what? There are things that are appointed for the consequence of the expiration of the body, and there are things that are appointed to just be negative reciprocations upon your life. You want good health? Don't eat pork. Okay? It's as simple as that. You ingest things, and maybe it's not pork, maybe it's the other poisons, maybe it's the other things that are commanded in Torah to not consume. But the point being is that you consume them, then you're gambling with your health. Not that there's some sort of judgment going to fall upon you and now you're going to burn in hellfire. That's not how Yahweh does things. That's right, I said that. Okay, and so the premise is that now the concept is the protections are pulled away, and who knows what's going to happen. But anyways, dad created this, now the son created this, now the grandchild is like, yeah, I remember, he's grown up now. I remember when my grandfather used to do this. I have the recipe. I know the secret ingredients, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to have a pig roast. And now we have generational curse. in the sense of memory being context sensitive, in the sense of what? Of legacy, of the maker, the receiver, and now the keeper. Now you see how we can roll this back into Torah. You see, I had to show you the family tradition that doesn't necessarily honor Torah in order to show you the family tradition that you should be doing according to Torah, according to the teaching and instruction of the intensification of all power in the universe. A force of benefit that became flesh, dwelt among us, gave an example of how to do it, wasn't always tempted but did not sin, which gave us an example and a truth that we also could achieve that, but we choose not to, etc. And then, of course, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. He gave us imputation of his righteous standing as having authority, power, and collective conscience without merit and without interference. Which means what? If you move into the teaching and instruction of Yahweh, the cycles are a force of benefit, but they are created through the tradition of the context sensitivity of the why, right? Of the why, of the cause, of the reason that the things are the way they are. To the extent that in 2001, an airplane crashes into the World Trade Centers, causing the buildings to fall and creating a world economic crisis on the dawn of the end of a Shemitah. On the dawn of the end of a Shemitah, the end of a 7-year period in which we are supposed to allow the ground to go fallow and do not. Harshness of the lack of protections fell upon a covenanted nation with God, and then repeated itself 7 years later again with the 2008 housing crisis. Meaning what? Meaning that Torah is activated within the entire universe of existence. You either honor it or you don't. You either walk in it or you don't. But it is a force of benefit that became flesh, dwelt among us, gave an example of how to do it, proved that it could be done perfectly. In fact, it says that Abraham kept Yahweh's covenant perfectly. I'm sorry, Yahweh's commandments perfectly. You say, wait a minute, Torah wasn't written. Oh, if a Gentile who does the things of Torah, though not having Torah, shows themselves to be a law unto themselves, and that Torah has been written on their hearts. Right? So, and then, of course, we get into the idea of righteousness, right? It was Abraham believed God and was accounted him for righteousness. So what is righteousness? It is the imputation that Yeshua gave. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Abraham didn't have any merit. That's exactly what Paul says. He says, if there's any man who could have merit, it was Abraham. Why? Because he kept the commandments perfectly. That's what it says. And yet, he says he didn't have merit. He said, did that blessing come before or after he was circumcised? What's his point? Before or after he entered into covenant with God? Did he have that merit already? Yes, he did. Why? Because of Yeshua. Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. Sorry, but Abraham was a New Testament saint. So when we get into the concept here, what we need to do is understand the concept of legacy, of what we create in the simplicity of covetousness carries on into generations as some sort of influence, especially if it turns into like a family feud like the McCoys and the Hatfields. But the premise is that influence plays a role in this outward spiral, which happens to also be upward, but that would go back to our original spring-looking thing, right? But the concept, our original spring-looking thing, okay. But the concept is that basically what we are working with here is an idea that the intensification of all power in the universe, when he created the human brain, created it in such a way that it actually has context sensitivity to memories. Which is why we are given instruction on how to keep a feast day, and there's specific things that we're supposed to do. Remember, ceremony contains what? Symbols, what appears to be music, and activation. Which means what? We're going to find that in the feast days. We're going to find that in the signs, the seasons, the years, and the days and the years. Signs, seasons, days, years. All based upon the movement of the objects in the elliptical. All based upon a movement of the objects in the elliptical, including the zodiac. So when we're working with new information like this, we need some practical application. Well, the first would be is a necessity to see, because one of the things I want you to remember, and this is an important one, that I didn't really explain with my Yom Kippur thing. And it is this. Yom Kippur only honors context sensitivity. So let's say that, yeah, we could use our jewelry store analogy that I always use. Okay, so I'm at the jewelry store. I see a watch. I think it's nice. The worker is the salesperson is distracted. I think I can pocket it, so I do. Right now. Restitution says I have to pay back 1/5 of what I stole, or 25%, right? So, or I'm sorry, 20%. So in general, then I need to take that value, add 20% to it, take it back to the person. That's kind of demonstrative of repentance, right? If I keep the watch, then it's the cursed thing, right? This is just like Jericho. Or I'm sorry, the Battle of Ai, where the guy takes the wedge of gold after Jericho, after the Jericho conquest, and buries it under his tent. And of course, it brings a curse upon Israel, and they figure out that it's him, and they kill him and all that. But premise is I have the cursed thing now in my pocket, and I'm going to go into Yom Kippur and beat my breast and say, I stole, and please help me. I'm sorry, forgive me. What was me? And I still got the watch, right? Now, you got to get back the watch. You got to do the 20%. That's how it works. You steal, you give 20%. You steal, you give 20%. Let me repeat that one more time. You steal, you give 20%. Why do I say that? Because you guys are always deceptive in your business dealings and you wonder why things happen. Pay the 20% and see what happens. All right, and so the concept or the focus is then now we have the teshuvah. We have, okay, I gave back the watch, I gave the 20%. Hopefully they don't turn you in and put you into the American judicial system, which is an absolute violation of Torah. But anyways, now we move into Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur comes along, the angels go, oh, look, he stole a watch. All right, so then we got to tempt him to steal a watch again, which means somehow, some way, the entire universe is going to conspire to get me back in that jewelry store in that moment with a watch, with the person being distracted. That's context. Now, let's say that I go ahead and I keep the nice gold watch, right? I got my nice gold watch. I walk in the Yom Kippur, beat my breast, and don't even say a thing about it, right? And then it comes around to that season again, and what? I've got the watch. Now I have to have a watch stolen from me. But what context do I have to be in that? I have to be in a context that would show this, that would offer the same value as the store owner. Which means it might be years before I develop a business, or maybe I even put the watch on eBay or something like that, and somebody scams me and gets it. But the point is, I have to be in a state of selling a watch to reap. I've often taught that, you have the guy who commits adultery, or you have the woman who commits adultery, however it works out, and now all of a sudden they're divorced and everything's gone to the mess. That's not when you're going to be tempted. That's not when it's going to be the struggle. That's not when it's going to be the reciprocation. It's going to be when you fall in love again, get married, and now all of a sudden here comes that temptation again. And so what does that mean? That means sometimes it don't meet back for a while. And if it don't meet back for a while, then sometimes you might forget that it happened. And now all of a sudden, oh, woe is me. Why is this happening? Well, you might want to look back to reaping what you sow. I don't know how many times I've sat there and said, oh man, I did that like when I was 20. And it's happening to me because it had to wait for that context. So think about context as that circumstances have to be the same. So when Yahweh says, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. One of the things you need to get in your mind is that there's not just one Sabbath. The circumseptanian, the circumseptanian Sabbath is the seventh day Sabbath. But there is a 7-year Sabbath, and there's a 50th year Sabbath, and there is a Passover Sabbath, and there is a Pentecost Sabbath, and there is a Tabernacle Sabbath. And so what we need to get our minds wrapped around is remember the Sabbath to keep it holy means we need to create context with all of these things and begin to move in a direction of removing the reciprocations that are going to cause detriment or lack and decrease in our life by making adjustments at Yom Kippur, beating our breasts, etc., but also the premise that we are also going to come around to temptations at times that is the inception, that is the legacy maker. Now, the guy that steals the watch, I steal the watch and I go through my life, and for some reason, my child starts stealing watches. Influence, right? And so the way that I want you to think about this is what legacy do you want to leave? But also what legacy do you want to have you already created that you need to unmess? What memories, what context sensitivities, what information have you created that has actually caused influence to a violation of Torah that has now created a legacy of a violation of Torah? It's a scary thought. That's why Yahweh says, remember the Sabbath day. He doesn't say, remember Christmas day. He doesn't say, remember your birthday when you shoplifted the toy gun. He says, remember the Sabbath day. Create a legacy that moves in the direction of what I do, and I, plausibly, rest on the Sabbath. That's what Yahweh does. So if that's what your God does, what are you doing saying that your circumseptanian rhythm is attached to your day off on Wednesday? Or worse yet, that Christ changed the day to Sunday when he resurrected from the dead. And so now you're going to take and assign your circumseptanian rhythm to what? To the pew. And you're going to listen to the Christian rhetoric that I can tell you their legacy is like this. We don't like Jews. Therefore, we're going to make our own doctrine. We're going to make our own holidays. We're going to take an absolutely pagan child exploitation holiday of Ishtar and assign it to the resurrection of the Messiah and celebrate all of the things from Ishtar, like dyeing eggs and making things spring-like and having bunnies and all kinds of other things. We're going to take all of those and we're going to what? Appropriate them and assign Christ to them, and we're going to replace the Passover that was commanded by the intensification of all power in the universe, because we don't want to be like the Jews. A further violation, 336 AD, if anyone is caught being idle on the seventh day, like the Jews are, they shall have no absolution. You lose your salvation. And then our blessed founders of the Protestant
movement, Luther, burn their synagogues and tear down their pulpits, the filthy rabble. And Calvin, I conclude that it is very possible that it is, it is plausible that it is impossible for a Jew to have absolution. Oh yeah, that guy, right? That's your people that want you sitting on Sunday morning when your circumceptarian rhythm, your circumceptarian rhythm is attached to the Shabbat because your Yahweh, your God, your creator is attached to the Shabbat. And here we are with cycles having what? The legacy of ceremony. Ceremony containing what? Symbols. Because why? Because your subconscious speaks in symbols. Right? Your subconscious speaks in symbols. It doesn't speak a language, doesn't speak English. Your subconscious speaks in symbols. Music, we're not going to get into that today. And action, activation. Activation of what? Of memory context sensitive actions. Reproduce the memory. So how do you reproduce the memory that you don't have, that only Yahweh has, and that somehow is in your brain? You don't work. You don't go out and gather sticks on Shabbat. Right? Simple as that. Don't get me wrong, when you are cold and you are hungry and night is approaching, you should probably build a fire. And if you haven't gathered sticks for that fire, then you should probably light that fire. There is a mercy and a dynamic to the preservation of life. It's just when you do it frivolously and you do it nonchalantly, like, oh, well, it's Saturday, so it's a good day to mow the lawn. You should probably go back, read your Bible, check and see what the dangers are of doing that in the first place. Okay? All right. So let's recap a little bit. We understand that memory is context sensitive, and depending on the intensity of the modalities and submodalities, we have a tendency to what? Identify greatly with those memories. We have a commandment to have a memory of a Sabbath that we have never experienced, that being the first Sabbath. That commandment means that we need to recreate the context of that first Sabbath, blessing, sanctifying, and ceasing. Okay? Which means there might be some things that you need to let go of that you do on the Sabbath. We are definitely not supposed to create legacies that result in generational curses, that result in the receiver practicing the same thing that the maker did, and that receiver then now what? Cursing themselves, and the shomer, right? The keeper of it, or the guardian of it, the one who carries the legacy to the next generation, doing the same exact thing, and therefore creating the same context of sin, which might be unto death or might not be unto death. It might be just lack and decrease. It might be a reduction in the protection of your health, a reduction in the protection of your wallet, a reduction in the protection of your social ingatherings. But in the end, memory is context sensitive, and therefore we create a context sensitive process through tradition. Tradition is the action of how you carry out a repeated event. If tradition is just a repetitious carrying out of an event, then we understand that we need to be careful what kind of traditions we create. Santa Claus. And then the idea is that as we go through this, there is also a necessity to understand that there's even deeper spiritual elements here, because we're only talking about one dimension. How much more in the dimensions where the law of forces is the order of the day, and that's what kind of thing is being attracted to you. Remember, malevolence begets malevolence, and benevolence begets benevolence. You attract to yourself the thing that you have
initiated. I promise you, a fear does not activate until you start making micro adjustments. And when you make those micro adjustments, the universe is like, oh, that's what he wants. I'm telling you, it's dangerous. And so at the core of this thing is an understanding that cycles go outward and upward and not just our dimensional repeats. Okay? That means that you create legacies through cycles as a result of influence, which is an outward expression of that cycle. An upward expression has to do with the elevation, the benefit that, you know what, when you get through the mess of the temptation and the not overcoming it and the failure, it's canceled, it's done, it's over with. You get the reciprocation, you're done. But remember, that reciprocation has to be context sensitive. It has to be the same thing. It has to have the same value. Why would the intensification of all power in the universe allow you to have some, $27 watch stolen when you had like $1,000 watch that you stole? And now the only time that you have this $1,000 watch is you inherited from grandfather who had to die first. And now all of a sudden you're going to try to sell it on eBay, and here comes some 16-year-old kid pretending to be some lady trying to buy it for her husband. And next thing you know, you're out of watch. That's how it works. And so when we are working with mechanisms that do not have a stop button, you need to think about what you're creating, right? Okay, enough said. So for those of you on YouTube, I love you guys.